There's a lot in your answer that I want to go into, because I would agree with you in terms of how Boris has been behaving. A couple of times I've seen his eyes light up. One recently was when he was asked about the proms, and all of a sudden he was back to himself. Yeah. And he was also, his piece in the Telegraph was quite vigorous around Churchill and the Black Lives Matter protests.
Finally, this is a very important thing, though.
I've got a lot I want to say, but you go.
Well, so obviously he was still ill, but when everything in the British past was being assailed, when people were pretending that the country that led the world, and a significant financial cost to this country, led the world and led the way in abolishing slavery, was somehow only to be interpreted through the lens of slavery, when every figure in British history was found not to live up to the standards of July 2020, you would have thought this was precisely Boris's moment. And when his own hero, the person about whom he cranked out a book, Winston Churchill, when Churchill's statue is assailed and ends up having to be boxed out, you would have thought this must be Boris's moment to speak. And there was silence. Silence from leading Conservatives, silence from Boris Johnson. Finally, there was statement. But the cenotaph was attacked repeatedly. The cenotaph to the dead of the world wars. Again, you have to question, firstly, any intentions of people who would assail such a holy place in this country. And I mean, every nation, every people have holy places. For us in Britain, the cenotaph is one such place, justifiably, absolutely justifiably. And there was something especially reprehensible, by the way, about the videos of some protesters taunting some young volunteers who turned out to be from the Household Cavalry, who were clearing Black Lives Matter graffiti off the cenotaph and said, "Your precious monuments." Yes, precious monuments, and make no apology for that. But this should have been a moment which should have clarified things, and the government, in my view, should not have waited days and been silent whilst the advantage was taken by the protesters. My own view, as I say, is that this is partly because of the Prime Minister's own illness, but also because of some wider trepidation. And that trepidation can now be seen in a clearer light. But the trepidation was clearly something along the lines of, in the immediate aftermath of Minnesota, you could push back on nothing that the Black Lives Matter protests were saying. And that is absolutely wrong. My friend Eric Weinstein made a very, very important intervention around this point. He said, "To my black brothers and sisters, I have something to say. If I cannot tell you that you are wrong, you are not my equal. If you cannot tell me I'm wrong, I'm not your equal." This goes every way. And there has been an inability, with all sorts of understandable justifications, but an inability that has existed in recent months, of anybody who is white to say no to anybody who is black, even if that person is behaving reprehensibly, for instance, by erroneously thinking that attacking the cenotaph is a good idea in the cause of racial justice. It doesn't need anyone to say, "No, your entire movement is nothing." It doesn't need that. It needs someone to say, "No, that is absolutely the worst move you could make." And yes, I think that it was revealing that there wasn't some kind of pushback, but everybody was scared. Look at most of the British press was scared. People have this impression from the outside that all the British newspapers, sharp-toothed. The British papers were scared at that moment, because when civil disobedience starts coming, and mobs start forming, and police started being attacked, and then police start retreating, all companies like private individuals, start to think of stepping back, biting their tongue.
Well, so Douglas Murray telling us a little bit about what was happening during the COVID time in Boris Johnson's prime ministry, when he was prime minister, and that there was fear and there was lack of leadership because he was sick and it was taking a long time for him to get better. So there was nobody stepping up to the plate, basically. And what was going on with the BLM riots, the BLM protesters, he was saying there was absolutely no pushback. And what was he talking about? That the British press, the British papers, the journalists, who are supposed to be renowned for their bulldoggedness and that they're, bite, and that they go after everybody or silenced. And the same thing was happening here in the United States of America, folks, across the pond. The same thing was going on over here. In the very beginning, statues were being taken down just because it was a Confederate soldier, or just because he might have his great great grandmother on his father's uncle's niece's nephew's cousin's side, owned half a slave or whatever. Oh, get rid of that, statue. They were going after. Would anybody have ever thought that people would attack George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, or George Washington? No, they'll never attack George Washington. They'll never try to take his statue down. They'll not. The George Washington mascot at George Washington University, I don't know if they got rid of him or there was a petition to get rid of him. I mean, this is unbelievable. This was happening across the pond on our side here, across the pond. And then, in terms of, also talk about that cancel culture. If you spoke up, and like you said, if you were white and you spoke up and said anything about BLM or anything about any minority, immediately the R word was thrown out. The B word was bigot, bigot, racist, phobe, all of this stuff. And people were losing jobs. People were losing sponsorships. Advertisers were leaving in droves. So this was hurting people right where it hurts, in the pocketbook, whether it was an individual or whether it was an entity or a company. This is why you have DEI, which I call DIE, diversity, inclusion, equity. It should be DIE, not DEI. This is where all this stuff came up. And people on the left, progressives, they took full advantage and rode that tsunami all the way in, and continue to do so. Not at the great heights of the tsunami as it was previously a few years ago, but that tsunami is quelled, but they're still riding on some of the afterwaves, coming by. And then when he was talking about, there were certain things that you would have thought that would unite a country, that would be the historical nature, your documents, the memorials, the cemeteries of the fallen, of the graves of the places that you could visit, of the founding fathers, their homes, where they were buried, where they went to school, those kind of things. And what's happening? Defacing them, graffiti, all kinds of stuff. Look at what Just Stop Oil is doing. They're throwing paint and orange-colored soups and all kinds of stuff on multi-million-dollar paintings, on statues inside art museums. And somebody's got to stand up and basically say, look, there's a line you don't freaking god dang it cross. You just don't do it. But people are afraid. I mean, there are a lot of people speaking up, but there's a lot of people in high places that just are shutting up. Anyways, folks, let's get back to the interview with Doug at Political Joe. You're watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. And this is what we have on tap for you folks today, where I give you my political prescription from my political perspective of what happens when everything starts to collide. Social media, education, science, biology, culture, religion, politics. Let's get back to Doug right now.
It's one of the infuriating things around this for me is Churchill is either the greatest Briton or a disgusting racist. And it's like, well, it could be both. History is grey, it's complex. There isn't
I'm afraid that this generation has not been taught that. I can say it absolutely as boldly as that.
And it's humility. It's I think it was Arendt you quoted last time, forgiveness.
Yes. And I now operate on the assumption that nobody knows anything. And it's not a bad presumption to start with. And I'm enormously saddened by that fact. I was speaking to a 96-year-old friend yesterday who made this point. He said, just find that nobody knows anything. Nobody knows any history. Now that might be a particularly strongly felt view when you're 96, because you've got a longer memory than most. But as I say, the real problem is this. If you don't know history, if you don't know very much history, or if you know tiny little glimpses of it, what you do is you stand in judgment over your forebears. And one suggestion I make, I think, in the Madness of Crowds about this in the forgiveness chapter is treating the past reasonably is, among other things, sensible because it gives you a glimpse into how your own life is going to go. The COVID era is a good example. We have no idea if the COVID era is the finale of something, the curtain raiser, the first act, the prelude, the prologue. We don't know which act we're in. We have no damn idea. And here's the thing, no one ever does.
So
No
true.
one ever does. And
So true.
a certain humility is required in that situation. How should you act? As well as you can, given the information you've got. Will you act perfectly, even if you think you're the best person? Absolutely not. And so you have to be very careful, among other things, of thinking you know what is right and imposing your concept of right on everybody else, because you may turn out, and historically there has never been anyone who has escaped this, to be wrong.
Originally raised was sort of Boris Johnson's bright-eyed, bushy tail when it comes to these culture war moments. And I'm glad you raised coronavirus, because in my eyes, when he starts talking about, Rule Britannia at the last night of the proms, does anyone care? And is it a distraction from the worst excess death rate? Even if the virus isn't as bad as we thought it was, is it a distraction from the worst excess death rate in Europe, the worst economic performance of a G7 country?
My view is not. I'll tell you why, because at times of national crisis, something very interesting is revealed, and I think coronavirus did this. We had been talking, I think it may have come up when we last spoke, we've been talking in the UK in recent years as us being a completely divided country.
Yeah.
Actually, a Conservative Prime Minister told the British public to remain in our houses, and we did. And we did. Who did we want to hear from? The Queen.
Yeah.
Okay? So we were said to be this country that couldn't unite around anything. And come a pandemic.
So Douglas is being absolutely correct that nobody knows history anymore. And if they do know history, it's a history that's being rewritten. Rewritten by who? Rewritten by liberals, by leftists, by progressives who control what? The school systems, control kindergarten, pre-K, elementary school, middle school. Books are being written through who? Being provided by funding by George Soros and a whole multitude of leftists. Rewriting everything, making it look as if Western Europeans were just the absolute worst in terms of the slave trade, when the whole world was in on it. And nobody talks about the slave trade from the Slavs, the slave trades, that was being done, the Barbary pirates, a slave trade that was done through the Islamic empires, the slave trade that was being done through the Ottoman and the Turkish empires. I mean, slave trade through the Indian, you go on and on and on. And then they want to erase history, taking down statues, taking down monuments. If they could, they'd burn the Constitution, they'd burn the Bill of Rights, they'd burn everything. They'd take the Liberty Bell away. If the left and the liberals and the progressives had their way in the United States of America. And everybody's a critic. Everybody's a critic. And they're basing it what? They're basing people's behaviors and things that they had done 100, 150, 200, 250 years ago, the founding of this country. The people that came over here in the beginning, on the myth, all that they're basing on societal norms of today. Everybody's a freaking critic. Everybody. And finally, I just want to make sure, when he was talking about galvanizing a country and how people listened to the conservative government and told them to stay home, well, I don't know about in the UK and in England, but here in the United States, it wasn't just being telling. It was almost like being freaking forced to do things against your will, against your rights, against everything that this country stood for. And this is one reason why Trump is so great on the cultural issues, because he stands tall on those. He shows everybody that you need to go on offense. You can't play defense in politics. You can't play defense on cultural issues. You can't play on the culture wars. You must go on offense. You must be able to say, enough is enough. We're not going to take that crap anymore. This is part of our culture, is part of our identity. You're not going to rip it away from us. That's why Trump is the leader in this thing here, and a lot of people love him, if not for anything else, but for that aspect alone. Anyways, folks, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. You've been watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. I've been your host, Dr. Nasir. If you haven't done so already and we've earned your subscription, subscribe to the channel, like, share, and follow us. You know what to do. Check out our other video links above and below. And I'll leave you with my final thought, which is always, when you're right, and when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.